All right. Well, welcome everyone to episode 54 of Wednesday Night Live. And tonight we'll be talking about obesity and diabetes. And I always say that my goal is for you to become your own authority in health, which basically means understanding things from a deeper perspective, sort of looking down and getting a good idea of general concepts so that you can make decisions for yourself. And tonight we're going to be going through looking at diabetes and obesity from a historical perspective. And that basically, the reason why I find that really valuable is because it gives you context for looking at our environment and the situation that we're in and understanding how we arrived where we're at, and understanding how disease is a reflection of the changes in human society and the way we lived over the years. So when we see it not as some sort of nebulous disease that has certain characteristics, but we see the historical, progression of why we have epidemics of diabetes and obesity, it allows us to see things from sort of a deeper level. So that's what I find to be really fascinating about it. So I'm going to share my screen and we're going to get started. All right, here we go. I think you can see my screen. Let me blow it up a little bit. Okay. So I came across an article that was looking at it from an evolutionary perspective by this author. And I used her article as sort of a departure point for looking at things from to a deeper level and understanding the historic, consequences of various changes in people's lifestyle. So we're going to start out with a general introduction. We'll then proceed to really defining obesity, defining type 2 diabetes, looking at sort of the history of these things. We'll also talk about what's called the Thrifty Hypothesis, the hypotheses of the thrifty gene. And that'll allow you to get an interesting context on how we look at various populations and why they have higher amounts of diabetes. And then we're going to look at evolutionary medicine, but more particularly looking at it from the perspective of where were we in terms of our biology many, many years ago, where are we now, and what can we do about it to restore our health? Because what's really happened is we've basically taken a human being that evolved in a certain environment and sort of dropped them into an environment that is going to lead to things like obesity and diabetes. And when we can look at the general connections between those, then not just for a population, not just for looking at these diseases on a worldwide scale, but looking at them just for our individual health, we start to see that it's not a question of looking for an ideal when it comes to ideal amount of activity, the ideal diet, but actually having a better understanding of really where we are, where we're going, and being smart about it. Having instead of just thinking about it from a list of facts, having some sort of general wisdom to be able to make decisions. So let's jump right into it. There's a lot to cover. And I think you'll find it interesting. So let's start out with an introduction. A lot of these stats you may or may not know, but I found them to be very interesting, so I included them. In 2008, that was sort of the first year where the number of people with obesity exceeded those suffering from starvation and malnutrition. And that is an interesting fact because you'll see that as we go through things, we'll get a better historical view of that sort of thing. Diabetes is sort of this combination of people who have type 2 diabetes who also have diabetes. 1.9 billion adults worldwide are currently overweight, with 600 million characterized under the definition of obesity. We'll talk about general definitions in a moment. And if you've been listening to any of my classes over the last 54 weeks, you'll know that I've spent quite a bit of time talking about the associated diseases of obesity and diabetes. But as a general review, for obesity, as well as diabetes, there's an increased risk of coronary artery disease, heart attacks, stroke, high blood pressure, which is hypertension and high blood pressure. HTN is what doctors use as an abbreviation. Pancreatitis, osteoarthritis. So as your joints are under an excessive amount of load, that can wear down the joints and you can get osteoarthritis. And also there's increased risks of cancer. Diabetes, of course, there's risks of blindness and nephropathy, damage to the kidneys. And of course, we unfortunately, probably many of us know people who have had to have amputation of the lower limbs because of the vascular problems associated with diabetes. So let's talk a little bit about definitions of obesity before we get into looking at things from a historical perspective. So obesity can be defined as a level of adiposity that is sufficiently excessive to damage health, demonstrated by an increased risk of metabolic and cardiovascular diseases, such as diabetes, hypertension, stroke, and some forms of cancer. So this definition defines basically obesity as really any increase in weight that is revealing itself because of an increased risk of diseases like metabolic diseases, cardiovascular diseases, etc. The World Health Organization defines it as a BMI of greater than 30. Now, I think we spoke about body composition last week, and so we'll review a few of the things that we spoke about last week. But as we spoke about last week, BMI is not really the best indicator. One is that people have higher muscle mass are going to weigh a little bit more because muscle weighs more than fat. So the BMI can be skewed. What we want to focus on, just as a practical thing, is body composition. The reason that they don't focus on that internationally is because they have to have some sort of easy to calculate number that they can look at disease rates and such. So they look at a BMI of greater than 30. For Southeast Asians, specifically Indians, it's modified and they change the numbers. They lower the BMI because they have a very different, a differing pattern of obesity. They have a little bit more central obesity, which can sort of skew the disease rates and the BMI. So BMI, generally speaking, probably was, going back in history, probably wasn't even necessarily, I don't know the history of the BMI. It's not the most effective thing. I don't know what sort of ethnicity they used, but generally speaking, the one standout is Southeast Asians. It's not the best indicator. And of course, we spoke about last week, it's not the best indicator as well. Okay, so next is, we spoke about body composition. Morbid obesity is generally over 30, and then obesity is at least in the U.S. is generally considered to be greater than 25, or over. I think it's overweight, and then morbid obesity greater than 30. But what we really want to focus on an individual level is thinking about our general body composition, and we spoke about that last week, and I think it's important to know. One thing is we really want to know what our body fat percentage is. And there's lots of ways of doing that. There's skin calipers that you can buy where they have you sort of clip different areas, like pinching the skin under the tricep, and then some around the waist. And they can, then you average those numbers together. You can get a decent number if you know how to use the skin calipers properly. Bioelectrical impedance is something that you can buy, those scales. The scales are not that bad, actually, that that allow you to get body fat percentage. So these are inexpensive. You can buy them for $20 on Amazon. One that I recommend is a company called Fit Index. It has a very, very cheap one. I think it's like $20-something. And they also have a tape measure. I have it here actually, where you can actually measure different parts of your body to have a general idea of what your body composition is. DEXA scans, which many of you know as something that we use for bone density, but it is also can be used for body fat percentage, is actually incredibly accurate. And hydrostatic weighing, which we spoke about last week as well, where you sort of submerge yourself, and they're able to get what the difference between the lean body mass and body fat is based on your displacement of water in this bath. So it's very important for you to think about not necessarily your BMI, although you can start there. The goal is for each of you to start to focusing on body composition, and really the best thing for you to know is your body fat percentage. Of course, all of you know that we'll get into certain lab tests that I feel that you need to be aware of yourself. And I did a video many weeks ago that you can find on my YouTube channel, which is the 7 blood tests that you should know about. And I recommend that everyone sort of go and look at that video. Okay, so let's go into the definition of type 2 diabetes. And diabetes is a chronic progressive disease that occurs when the pancreas is unable to produce the hormone insulin sufficiently, or when the target cells are unable to use the insulin effectively, even if the pancreas produces it. Generally speaking, for type 2 diabetes, we really speak more about insulin sensitivity and how the body is not responsive to the insulin that the pancreas is producing. Like the pancreas is trying its best to keep up with all the chronic problems that come with obesity and type 2 diabetes, and it's trying its best, but ultimately the end product is the body is not capable of utilizing the insulin properly because of insulin insensitivity. Now, the American Diabetes Association focuses on the definition being a random glucose greater than 200, a fasting glucose greater than 126. Everyone should know what their fasting glucose is. An A1C that's greater than 6.5, and sometimes they do oral glucose test. And that would be where they give you glucose, and then a couple hours later, they check to see what your blood sugar is. The World Health Organization will keep that up there. The fasting glucose of greater than 140 is the World Health Organization. And again, I want to stress more than anything else that these are, in order to write articles, in order to look at disease rates, they have to come up with definitions. And that doesn't mean that when you get below these numbers, that somehow all your disease rates just disappear. That's why I want to speak a little bit about pre-diabetes. So pre-diabetes has been sort of defined as a fasting blood sugar of 100 to 126, hemoglobin A1C of 5.7 to 6.4. So here we have A1C of 6.5 and greater. And then we have 100 to 126, and then 126 and above. I know this sounds like details, but quite frankly, I think these numbers are very important both for you and your family. All of you should know that if you go to the doctor and they check a fasting glucose and it's 110, your doctor is probably not even going to say anything because it doesn't fit the criteria of type 2 diabetes. But I'm going to tell you now that there are absolute definitive risks associated with prediabetes. Again, I think it makes sense to all of you that disease rates are not just magically going to disappear because you've gone from a fasting glucose of 120 to 127. The fact is that while the rates of disease are definitely greater when you get above these numbers, which I want you to know, again, they'll be tested later with our test. you do want to remember this 6.5, and you really want it lower than, quite frankly, you want it as low as possible. We've spoken about A1C before, and A1C is basically a reflection of blood sugar binding to the protein in your red blood cell. So it's a general indicator of blood sugar binding to various parts of your body. So when blood sugar binds to protein, as I've mentioned many times in the past, it binds irreversibly, which means that once it latches onto the protein, it doesn't go anywhere. So what does that cause? It causes all kinds of things, from diabetic retinopathy, blindness in the eyes, in the skin, it causes wrinkling. In the tendons, it causes stiffness. These are the things that actually age you. So a lot of anti-aging specialists look at A1C as a general indicator of aging. So you want to know this number, and you want it to be as low as possible. What are the risks of prediabetes? Well, believe it or not, there's risks of myocardial atrophy, meaning they look at the ventricle and they see that as the blood sugar goes up, even into the pre-diabetic range, there's some myocardial atrophy, which can be reflected actually in cardiac fitness, where they measure the function of the heart. And believe it or not, people who are pre-diabetic, people who are have obesity but do not have prediabetes, the same people have much greater cardiac fitness. There is kidney problems associated with prediabetes. So more than 1/3 of people with prediabetes have albuminuria. Sorry for the spelling mistakes here. And reduced glomerular filtration rate, meaning reduced function of your kidneys. So here we have a situation, again, where not all doctors, maybe they'll say, oh, you have a lot of them will say, oh, you have prediabetes. You really need to get this taken into control. Or sometimes they'll just say, yep, you're not diabetic, but you are pre-diabetic, and that might be the end of it. What I'm here to tell you is, one, that A1C is a general indicator of aging and blood sugar. Both sort of go hand in hand, and you want it low as possible. Two, you want to know your number. So you want it to be under 5.7, preferably under 5.5 if you can. And I've made a video on prediabetes on my YouTube channel, where you can watch it. It goes into much more detail about prediabetes. So if you've been diagnosed with prediabetes, I recommend that you watch that. And I go through some various things to help with that situation. So 100 to 126 is prediabetes, fasting blood sugar. Again, I think it makes sense to all of you that, the number of 126 is not some magical number where disease rates increase. You want these things to be low. And as I said, this is an indicator of general aging as well. Okay, one moment. All right. So let's go through a little bit of the history, and we'll start with obesity. And obviously, it's not unknown in history. There are statuettes from, tens of thousands of years ago. The fertility gods like the Venus, this is like 20 or 30,000 years old. So obviously, obesity is not something that is, it's rare, but it's certainly not unknown. Hippocrates had to say this regarding obesity. It is very injurious to health to take more food than the constitution will bear, when at the same time one uses no exercise to carry off this excess. For as ailment fills and exercise empties the body, the result of an exact equipoise between them must be to leave the body in the same state they found it, that is, in perfect health. So even way back then, Hippocrates had this idea about more food, less exercise, causing a problem in terms of health. So this is something that has been known from the beginning of recorded time. Type 1 diabetes, which is where the pancreas is basically loses its ability to produce insulin, generally speaking, has been known for thousands of years, and was almost virtually fatal until not that long ago in terms of the history of humanity. King Henry VIII's doctor said, "All sweet wines and grass wine doth make a man fat." And then we move into the 18th century, and diabetes was basically only seen in the upper classes. It was known as a disease of affluence, type 2 diabetes, that is. And diabetes is called diabetes mellitus, which means honey sweet, because the urine, when there's so much sugar circulating around the body, the sugar gets expelled through the urine. And the doctors smelled and actually would taste a little bit of the urine to actually sense the sugar. That's why it was called diabetes mellitus. Now, again, this was a disease of affluence. People who were not rich did not have diabetes. It was only because in the upper classes, they had excess food, they ate rich food. Unfortunately now, as we'll see in just a moment, what's happened is these diseases of affluence are now basically throughout society. And so what I'm trying to impart here is just a general understanding of how this sort of evolved. That moving on to the 19th century, diabetes and obesity were both increased, but they weren't epidemic. And it really wasn't until the late 20th century, because in the early part of the century, there were wars, there was depression. It wasn't until 1980 that we had this sort of prevalence of diabetes doubling since 1980, from 4.7 to 8.5%. And honestly, even into the late 20th century, it was still generally seen as a disease of affluence in terms of looking at it from a country perspective. Most of the countries around the world that had affluence, like the United States and Western Europe, those were the areas where you were seeing an increase in type 2 diabetes. But as we move now into the 21st century, what we're seeing is an epidemic of both obesity and diabetes that is basically happening in areas of the world that are low and middle income countries. And that is why we're getting this worldwide epidemic when it comes to both diabetes as well as obesity. So it basically sounds, if you are following the story up into this point, that we have this condition, both obesity and diabetes, that are, something that at least we've spoken about from the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th, 21st centuries as this disease of affluence. Next, we're going to talk a little bit about what this thrifty hypothesis is, and then we're going to talk a little bit more from a global historical scale, and you'll see why it's important in just a moment. So these thrifty hypotheses are based on this idea that genes, specifically talking about the thrifty genotype hypothesis, that there are basically evolutionary an adaptive change that basically selected people who are going to be more thrifty with their genes, meaning that if they may have evolved the situation with lots of communities, specific communities, where there were lots of periods of, famine and decreased food, and therefore selected out genes that were capable of storing energy as fat easier, and those people would survive, and the population in that community would therefore have a set of genes that is really, really good at storing excess calories for fuel, because of course fat is fuel, so that they could survive. And this was popularized by James Neal, and using examples of, there's a community of Pima Indians in the Southwest that has, I believe, the highest rate of diabetes in the United States. And again, the idea here is that they were adapted to a high frequency of periods of famine and starvation, which resulted in individuals who were able to store energy efficiently, energy being fat. So when this type of community who has these individuals who can store this energy so efficiently, what happens when they are exposed to a Western environment? Well, they're able to mobilize these calories and put them into fat much easier than another population that didn't have the same sort of periods of frequency, selecting out people who were more energy efficient in terms of depositing fat. So this is the genotype hypothesis. Now, genotype is basically related to genes. Phenotype is generally related to appearance. I define these because sometimes you're going to hear people discussing the difference between genotype and phenotype. So genotype, genes are to genotype as appearance is to phenotype. Now, the phenotype thrifty hypothesis was something that happened that was developed by these two guys, Barker and Hales, in the UK. And what they said was that it was environmental, which is also part of sort of phenotype, but environmental stress factors in early life. So it wasn't necessarily changing the genes, but it was affecting, from an external point of view, environmental stress factors like malnutrition and low birth rate that might be the development of diabetes later on in life. There's various controversies in terms of both of these, but they are important. And the genotype, the thrifty gene hypothesis, is something that I was taught in medical school. And really, if you were to ask most doctors, they tend to believe that this is the case, because obviously there are communities like the Pima Indians, like the Australian Aborigines, like the populations in the South Pacific that evolved, or I shouldn't use the word evolved necessarily, but basically culturally and developmentally, they were in areas where there were periods of famine and starvation, or they were living lives that selected out people who were more energy efficient, or in terms of storing energy. And when modern culture comes around, then basically we're going to have a mismatch between the genes as they were throughout history and what's happening now in terms of these various things. Okay, so let's move on to the final section, and that is looking at what has sometimes been called evolutionary medicine. And let me blow this up a little bit. So we've sort of spoken about this already, that the obesity and diabetes epidemic sort of represent a mismatch between the environment in which our ability to store energy efficiently in adipose tissue evolved and our recent environment. So in other words, essentially, one could look at it from the perspective that we are just mismatched between our environment and our ability to create fat. If we evolved in a different situation where we consistently had food, it's unlikely that we would have the same kind of epidemic, because our genes would be selected out for situations where we had excess food, which would mean that we would probably become less efficient at storing fat if that were the case. But obviously that's not how humanity evolved. Humanity evolved in a situation where people who could store and create fat quicker survived better than those who couldn't. And this is part of the idea of what we're talking about. Now, the hunter-gatherer lifestyle, really, if you look at it, technically, most people think that it was around for 98% of human history. And that, again, in addition to this idea about storing calories and such, that only physically active individuals were also able to survive long enough to reproduce successfully and ensure the survival of their offspring. Those that were more physically active were able to procure food and had a survival advantage, basically. So in addition to speaking about these periods of storing fat tissue, we also have probably the selection of people who were more physically active, which basically means that we have in our genetics, this requirement that we are meant in some way to be physically active, to be able to reproduce. So obviously, efficient energy stores, however, were essential for reproduction and growth under these living conditions, especially a sufficient amount of adipose tissue, but not obesity, which enables females to reproduce successfully. As many ultra marathon or highly active, overly active women who have too low body fat, they generally tend to lose their periods. So women do need a certain amount of adipose tissue and generally are healthier with more body fat than men. So famines, as proposed by Neal, which was the genotype, that thrifty gene, were a rare condition among forager populations. So this is what led to the popularization of the paleo diet. That is the idea of the paleo diet, that we were hunter-gatherers for 98% of human history, and therefore we are best suited for, this is what the theory represents, and I'll talk a little bit about why I don't think that that is a complete understanding of the picture, but the theory behind the paleo diet is basically that we want to mimic what we were in terms of humanity for most of human history. Then the Neolithic, so this is the Paleolithic, and then the Neolithic period started, which was 20,000 years ago, and that's when agriculture started. And when you look at the skeletal remains, because of the increase in grains, you see dental cavities, you see some protein deficiency. There were also signs of periodic famine, and there were also increased infections that some people theorize are directly related to the fact that humans, after the hunter-gatherer stage, and they started to create cities and agriculture, started to have essentially farms where they were using animals to help, or started cultivating agriculturally animals, and that there was an increased risk of infection. So this also lends credence, I guess you could say, to the paleo diet theory that, again, here we have if you look at the remains, you don't see dental caries, you generally don't see protein deficiency. There was decreased infections, assuming enough calories in the hunter-gatherer, skeletal historical analysis, I guess you could say. So people of paleo diet says, well, if all of these bad things started to happen as a result of the introduction of agriculture, where there was a lot of grains and such, then it makes sense for us to go back to the hunter-gatherer lifestyle, and therefore will improve our health. And that's sort of what the theory is. Again, we'll talk a little bit about why, although that has validity, I find that it isn't a clear representation of what sort of an ideal diet may or may not be. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. Okay, so then we move on to the post-Neolithic, and that's where we see, in terms of, like, you look at mummies from ancient Egypt, you start to see signs of atherosclerosis, heart disease. And basically, in terms of activity, movement, etc., it pretty much stays the same. Most people involved with still, agriculture out and fairly active stayed until the Industrial Revolution, when there was a decline in physical activity. So this gives you a general overview of human history, moving from hunter-gatherer to agriculture, which had both its positives, which I didn't mention. I mean, obviously the positives are that we didn't have to spend all our time procuring food, that we could grow our own food. And this certainly led to the growth of cities and intellectual achievements, and obviously was responsible for us becoming, the intellectual humans that we are today, that are capable of improving our environment and that sort of thing. There is a general movement, small but growing, of people who travel to, there are still a few hunter-gatherer communities that you can go and visit in Africa, and see sort of how they live and that sort of thing, and people trying to sort of duplicate that in terms of what kind of diet they think that these communities have. That's probably worth, it's probably another type of lecture, I suppose. So moving on, Asia. So we spoke about how it was a disease of affluence of people who were rich, and then it was a disease of affluent nations like the United States and Western Europe. And now we have this globalization of both diabetes and of obesity. And in China, as an example, in 1980, there was 1% of patients with diabetes and obesity, and now we're hitting 2008. It was 10%. And I can say, I've been traveling because of Miracle Noodle. I traveled to Japan for the last 15 years, and it's obviously a non-scientific evaluation, but Japanese generally are not obese. They have a very low level of obesity, but I see, even over those 15 years of traveling there, I've seen just personally an increase in diabetes well, there definitely is an increase in diabetes, but also just visually seeing a lot more obesity there as well. India, it's an epidemic. Type 20, literally 20% of the population has type 2 diabetes. I think there are a lot of reasons for that, which don't necessarily have to do with the fact that they obviously eat a lot of rice, but there's also a lot of vegetable oils, fried foods that have sort of crept into the diet as well. We've spoken about Pacific Islanders and Australian Aborigines, Pima Indians, etc. But these are more recent communities that are suffering from sort of influx of Western style diet as well as Western lifestyle, and have high rates of diabetes and obesity. And migrants also have a very high rate. And one could think about it as you're taking one person in potentially an environment that it is not, quote, obesogenic, leading to obesity, and sort of transplanting them into an environment that's completely different. And therefore, it's the environment in terms of dietary norms and toxins and a whole host of differences in activity. And that's why we see in migrants a very high rate of obesity. So we've spoken now about thinking about things, not just from a historical perspective, but also thinking about the current environment as what we call an obesogenic environment. We now live in modern society in such a situation that the environment itself is potentially leading to obesity without us even really thinking about it. And I think one of the great things about having a discussion about this, or listening to a lecture, I guess, is that, again, you can see things from a very different perspective. And it also, I think, makes you more likely to look at it objectively and realize that somehow we have to extricate ourselves and remove ourselves from this obesogenic environment. In other words, live in it, but customize our lifestyle in such a way that the environment isn't going to touch us. It's not gonna push us towards obesity. We're not gonna let it do that, because we understand it from a historical perspective, and now we understand it as we go through this next section. We understand it from a much deeper level. So obviously, the positives of changes throughout history are we have a decrease in infections, which have led directly to a rise in life expectancy. So there are some positives to, obviously, modern society. Of course, as I probably don't even need to mention that. I think we should be completely amazed and grateful for the blessings of American society. I mean, if you were to take a king from ancient England or anywhere and bring him to, the poorest person in the United States, the not saying that there's, people are not suffering, but a king from that time would see, indoor plumbing and would see the TV and would see, the indoor water and that sort of thing, and it would be amazing. So we have an enormous amount to be grateful for that we don't even, put much attention to. So I don't want to make it seem like the environment that we're in is terrible. We're incredibly blessed, obviously. But what we do need to see is what parts of our environment are taking away from our health. And speaking about the TV, we'll talk about that in just a moment. So let's actually talk about it now. Obviously, there's decreased movement. Remember now, we evolved up and from basically we spoke about the Paleolithic time where people were hunter and gatherers, were walking miles and miles a day. Last week, we spoke about how probably we're meant to walk, a good 3 to 5 miles per day. That's probably, the minimum amount of effort and movement that is required for overall health. And if we look at it from that perspective, looking at it from a historical perspective, it starts to make sense to us. At least that's what I'm hoping that you get, that we are trying to match what we have evolved as over the years. And the more we learn, the better we get at sort of estimating that. So yeah, it's probably 3 to 5 miles that we're supposed to walk on a regular basis. Little energy to get food. Not like the Paleo times, not even like later on in Neolithic when people were in agriculture, they were still out in the fields and they were working. Some terrible stats: 26% of 18 to 16-year-olds watch at least 4 hours per day. 67% watch at least 2 hours per day. I mean, I can't imagine sitting for 4 hours watching. Of course, with COVID and people binge watching all those Netflix series, 4 hours is probably not a big deal for most people. But if you think about it from a historical perspective, sitting for 4 hours, and we know that is incredibly inflammatory. I think it was Jack LaLanne who we mentioned last week used to say, humans are the only machine that break down when you don't use them. And it's another amazing quote of his. But the truth is that we were not meant to sit, and we were meant to keep on moving. And again, I'm hoping from this lecture, you see it from a more historical perspective. Only 19% of high school students are physically active for 20 minutes or more per day. And 60% of US adults are not regularly physically active. And 25%, literally 1 in 4 people in the United States are absolutely not regularly not active at all. No exercise, no nothing. So again, looking at this from a historical perspective, we really, if these stats, obviously, even before this lecture would make you think how terrible it is. But now that we understand it from a historical perspective, it makes us realize how terrible and damaging this actually is, because it just doesn't fit with our biology in any way. And this is leading to partly one of the things leading to the epidemic of diabetes and obesity. One thing that wasn't mentioned in the article that inspired this video or this class is toxins, and specifically arsenic. Now, we spoke about arsenic before, but it's important from a diabetic perspective. First of all, low levels cause damage to DNA. So you can see skin, lung, bladder cancer. But when it comes to diabetes, it can actually damage the pancreas. And remarkably, if you look at people with obesity and divide them up based on level of toxicity, those in the lower 10% show absolutely no association with diabetes, meaning those with the lowest levels of toxins in their body, even if they're obese, show virtually no increase in diabetes. Now, that is an incredible thing. And I've seen other experts say that perhaps 15 to 20% of type 2 diabetes is directly related to toxin exposure. But speaking about obesity in general, BPA is probably the toxin most implicated with worsening and or causing obesity, speaking of that. And so that's why it's, but arsenic as well is considered an obesogen, meaning helping to lead to diabetes. But BPA, which is found in plastic products, it's found in receipts, like those, paper receipts at a very high level. So just sort of if you were working with those, or you're crinkling them and playing with them, that, believe it or not, is a significant BPA association. It's also found in the lining of cans, especially acidic products. So if you get canned, say, tomatoes as an example, you want to make sure that it's a BPA free can. But it's important to note that there is an association. So we're adding another layer of complexity to the environment that we're in. So we have historically this decrease in physical activity. We have an increase in energy dense foods like sugar and fat that are getting into our diet that wouldn't be found back in history. And now we have toxins as well. So we have a lot of things stacked up against us, but now you have the knowledge about these things, so it can help you make changes. And not only, I should say that a lot of times people don't feel comfortable making changes because it doesn't fit in with the cultural norms of the community that they're in. What I'm hoping is that when you see these things from a historical, biological perspective, you think to yourself, well, the communal norms that you may be, that you may be in are going to not make as much sense to you, and will give you sort of the strength and inspiration to be able to make those lifestyle changes, no matter what, the people around you in whatever culture or community that you're in might say. Because I have to say strenuously that when I have patients that make substantial lifestyle changes and see improvements, one of the biggest reasons that they don't succeed and don't continue to progress is because of just blowback, not blowback, but negative feedback from the communal norms, either in their family or in their immediate community. Maybe they're in a family where no one exercises, and and they are looked negatively upon because they're trying to improve their health. This sort of societal family pressure is probably the number one thing that I see amongst patients, clients, that leads to them not continuing with their lifestyle improvements. And I always think of this one particular patient I had she was, late 20s, early 30s. She had severe eczema since she was a teenager, and we changed her diet. We really improved her overall lifestyle. She lost 15 pounds in around 4 to 6 weeks. Her eczema was clear for the first time since she was a teenager, and she was absolutely ecstatic. And then I saw her back a couple months later, and she had gained all her weight back, and her eczema was back. She looked depressed, and I said, "What? I try not to. People have to. I don't force people to make changes. You have to honor people's decisions, but which is very important. But I asked her, what the situation was, and she basically just said that she was getting too much stress from her family for changing her lifestyle in such a way that improved her health, and she just asked for more pills and medicine to make the eczema go away. So the point I guess I'm trying to make that comes up again often is, I think one of my goals for these classes is for you to see things from as many different perspectives as possible, so that those societal and family pressures don't seem to be all that important, so that you have the strength to be able to make those lifestyle changes. Okay, anyway, so where's it found? Water, chicken, rice. Water is a big one. So chicken, which I think chicken is problematic. You want to get the highest quality chicken as you possibly can, but there's very high levels of arsenic in just conventional chicken. And rice. So brown basmati from California, India, or Pakistan is probably the best choice. And the reason it's in rice is because of arsenic in the soil. And unfortunately, the arsenic in the soil gets contaminated. Okay, I got to speed things up a little bit since we're running out of time. Other sources, of course, farms because of the soil, paints, old toys. Okay, so bad news is probably a third of the U.S. population has some toxicity. Good news is it lasts only for 2 to 4 days. In other words, if you completely get rid of your arsenic in a week, it's almost all gone. So very, very good to know. And I'm going to skip this. We spoke about, if you look at, I did a class on toxins and went through that in detail. And then finally, we spoke about cultural cues. But additionally, I want to speak about some other cultural cues, and that is that different cultures have different ways of eating, different paces of eating. They have family dinners where people are sitting and enjoying conversation, and nowadays people are sitting in front of the TV where they lose cues to when to stop. They'll just eat whatever's on the plate. And I spoke about that several months ago, about how there were some incredible studies done with college students in the US and France, and the cultural cues to stop eating were very, very different. In the US, it was like, believe it or not, things like when do you stop eating? And one of the cues was when the TV show was over, instead of, the cultural cues that were in France. We also have a loss of satiety because we are eating things that raise our blood sugar. We have abnormally dense calories, so that the natural biological cues to feeling full, we've generally lost. You can regain those when you're eating completely unprocessed foods. You can regain the natural pleasures of natural foods. And all that usually reverses in 3 to 4 weeks of just really focusing on unprocessed foods. So what are the general lessons to learn here? I think that now all of you should realize that there are good reasons why why some people think you should be focusing on a paleo-like diet, but we haven't addressed all the things that we just spoke about. Toxins, we haven't spoken about loss of cues and all of these sorts of things that are new, loss of movement and these sorts of things. So it's hard really for you to prescribe an ideal diet for somebody based on history, because if we know anything now about the thrifty genes, certain communities are going to respond to different types of diets in various ways. So therefore, there is no ideal diet. And I think that's really important, because we have to understand that with all the above changes, reverting to another era ignores the unique challenges of today's society, which basically to me means that we need to be focusing on toxins. We need to realize we need to understand detoxification, or at least helping our liver and its natural detoxification, understanding movement in a much better way, customizing it for ourselves, and then focusing on getting rid of sort of the new innovative, I shouldn't say innovative, but the new abnormally dense foods that are around. And perhaps that means increasing vegetables because of their ability both to provide satiety and to help with the optimization, with the natural detoxification. And then finally, before our test, if we get to our test, I'd just like to say that, last week I spoke about Maimonides, and we spoke about some other ancient doctors about exercise. But if you look at their remedies, they have some very interesting remedies. And there were remedies that were used for like 1,000 years that were carried from ancient Greece through the Middle Ages. And the point is that if you look at some of these remedies, some of them are laughable, that you can't imagine that they would work. But the point is that the reason they survived for all those years is because they probably did work. But because of the environment and all of these external influences and all these changes, we are, in a sense, different in many different ways. And these are the lessons that we need to learn. Yes, we can learn from the past, and understanding all those changes that we went through are really helpful. But we have to understand that we are in a unique situation now where we should use what we learned, but also try to optimize the environment and understand our environment in the best way. So now let's go to our, let's stop my sharing of the screen, and we'll quickly go to our test. Okay, let's see if I can find that. Okay, so here we are. And you should see me on the screen. And now you should see me blow this up a little bit. We'll go through this test really quick. All right, let's see here. Back to test. And preview test. Okay, 10 questions. Let's start. And let me blow this up a little bit. All right. So which of the following is associated with diabetes and not obesity? So heart disease, stroke, blindness. Oh, let me pull up my chat box here. And blindness and high blood pressure. The answer is correct. C. That's right. Helen is usually the first one to answer, but Ryan beat her to the answer on this question. Okay, next. Which community is BMI notoriously not effective for? Caucasians, Africans, Southeast Asians, and Chinese? Yes, correct. And quite frankly, we've spoken now that as much as that's one factor, one metric that you should be aware of. You should know what your BMI is. You really want to focus on making sure you have an understanding, not just of your BMI, but also of your body fat percentage. Which metric is most important for you to know? A1C, body fat percentage, fasting glucose, or all of the above? Of course, you want to know all those, in addition to the 7 blood tests I review in that video on my YouTube channel. But we've spoken about A1C, about how it's an indicator of aging and of blood sugar. And we want to know what our body fat percentage is and our fasting glucose. What is the definition of fasting blood glucose for a diabetic? Yep, 126. And again, I want you to know these numbers. I want you to now, next time you go to your doctor or you log into your LabCorp or Quest center where the labs are done, and check out what your fasting blood sugar was. Okay, what is the A1C level for diabetic? Yeah. Okay. Prediabetes is harmless. True or false? Of course. Don't let anybody tell you it's harmless. It means you have your work. It means you have work to do. That's what it means. Genotype is to genes as phenotype is to disease rate, appearance, or diabetes rate. Correct. Okay. The hunter-gatherer lifestyle was present for what percentage of human history? According to people who talk about that sort of thing, 98%, correct? What toxin has been most associated with diabetes? PCBs, phthalates, BPA, arsenic. Arsenic. But BPA is most associated with obesity. And finally, when did agriculture start in human history? 20,000 years ago, 40,000 years ago, 300,000 years ago? Correct. So some people say that that human history is around 300,000 years old. So, all right, well, we hit 9 o'clock exactly. And I appreciate all of your attention. I do enjoy doing this, and I hope you enjoyed tonight's class. It gave you a little bit of a different perspective on something that you see in the news every day. And look forward to seeing you next week. We'll be talking about biological fasting and have some interesting things to share with you and how important that is. And again, wish everyone good health and take care of yourself. And again, thank you for your attention.